What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Picture the raw audacity of descending into a massive gas pipeline to strike from below. If it sounds like a page out of a bizarre war novel, it became all too real in the Kursk region, where Russian special forces allegedly tried to outmaneuver the Ukrainian troops, who had shocked everyone by seizing Russian soil earlier. Some observers call this infiltration a genius move by smart Russia's military planners. Others see it as an act of desperation that reveals just how stretched and strained the Russian side really is. We're trying to report the news on this channel as neutral as possible, guys, so we'll leave it up to you to decide what do you think motivated the Russian army to perform such a trick. Either way, it's another surreal development in a conflict already riddled with the unexpected. Kursk, an overlooked border zone as of recently, has once again morphed into a violent tug-of-war no one anticipated at this particular stage. When Ukraine first breached Russia's borders back in August 2024, most assumed it was a short-term move, maybe a headline grab, maybe a strategic play to compel Moscow into splitting its forces. Eventually, the biggest assumption became that it was for Ukrainians to improve their negotiating positions, so that they can demand something from Russia as well, in exchange for these territories. But as the days turned into weeks and then months, and Russia funneled more and more troops into Kursk, it became clear we were witnessing a far more complex battle than a simple raid. The war's usual talking points, defense of Donbass, control of the southern coastline, all faded into the background as Kursk took central stage, revealing a new layer of desperation, creativity, and horror. And every searching activity from either sides brings the attention to that region once again. Last August, Ukrainian forces crossed the border into Russia with disarming speed, taking roughly 1,000 square kilometers in a matter of days. That might not sound enormous compared to other battles, but psychologically, it landed like a sledgehammer. Towns like Sudzha, seldom mentioned in media reports these days, suddenly found themselves under Ukrainian control. People were left asking how an army that had primarily been on the defense could orchestrate such a swift, audacious move. In city centers from Kursk to Moscow, the question on many lips was the following: are we actually vulnerable on our own soil? And well, you cannot blame those civilians for feeling abandoned and endangered, because this is exactly what happened. The Kremlin had long insisted its borders were impenetrable. Yet, there was a highly motivated Ukrainian force scooping up territory and taking hundreds of Russian prisoners of war. Almost overnight, social media lit up with debates over how Russia could have missed this looming threat. Some blamed military command for being too focused on the eastern fronts. Others whispered about a lack of intelligence or a sense of overconfidence at the very top. Whatever the cause, the image of uncrossable Russian borders cracked in literally a second. People woke up in the morning, took their phones to read some news and notifications, and literally could not believe what was happening. Almost certainly there were people who thought they were still dreaming. So they probably had to rub their eyes, shake their heads and read the news once again, just to realize it is all true. Overnight, a defending nation turned offensive, capturing world's media attention and reigniting the hope that Ukrainian is still very much capable of fighting. Several months later, the offensive slowed down significantly, with the front lines moving in each direction just mere meters. But Ukraine always had that extra ace up their sleeve, ready to be pulled out during the upcoming negotiations. Because they knew that Putin will never freeze the war along current front lines, while internationally recognized Russian territory is under Ukrainian control. Unfortunately, the regime of Putin realized it as well, but could not just send all of its forces up north to Kursk region and sacrifice their current holdings in the east and the south of Ukraine. That's why it became such an enormous dilemma for Russia. Keep existing, much bigger Ukrainian territories under control, but risk losing your own land, or recapture a very small part of Russia and potentially lose thousands of kilometers of occupied Ukraine. For this reason, the stalemate in Kursk region lasted for so long. Until recently, unfortunately, when Russian army came up with some pretty creative, somewhat, solutions. As days stretched into months, it became clear Ukraine was not packing up and leaving. That's when the pipeline infiltration stories emerged. According to both Ukrainian officials and pro-Kremlin war bloggers, small Russian squads traveled almost 15 kilometers, almost 10 miles, inside a narrow 1.5 meters wide gas pipe, once a key artery for Russia's energy exports. Those corridors, just wide enough for a person to navigate, now served as a hidden battlefield. Some hailed this as tactical brilliance. Others asked how soldiers could bring supplies, evacuate wounded, or keep communication open in such a claustrophobic labyrinth. Reportedly, it took several days for them to cross the entire distance crawling, barely enough space to just fit with all the gear, let alone sleep or rest. Reports claim that some did not make it out alive out of this pipe, bringing the question whether other Russian soldiers had to drag them all the way to the opening just to not get stuck. Just imagine what they went through in this life-altering experience, all thanks to Putin's unjustified invasion. On the other hand, Ukraine's general staff responded with claims that the infiltrators were spotted immediately and targeted by artillery. In a war that's already defied logic, the fact that men in gas masks crawled through old pipelines to ambush the opposite force does not just raise eyebrows. It underscores a battle where conventional strategies seem tossed aside in favor of anything that might give a brief edge. It also rattles the nerves of ordinary civilians, knowing that what was once an economic lifeline is now a hidden route for armed assaults, reimagining infrastructure as weapons in the strangest possible ways. And honestly, it was not the first, definitely not the last time something like this will happen before the war ends. Ukrainians themselves in the past used abandoned underground tunnels and dried up water reservoirs just to bypass Russian defenses. At this point, when the front lines barely move, it is a matter of who can get more creative. Meanwhile, for the Ukrainian brigades clinging to their positions in Kursk, life is a day-to-day war for survival. Russian troops, said to number over 50,000, keep pouring into the region, aiming to wipe out or encircle those Ukrainians who dare to breach Russian territory. The once bold incursion now teeters on the edge of calamity, with artillery barrages cutting off supply routes and open-source maps suggesting entire Ukrainian pockets are at risk of unfortunately being surrounded. For the civilians who stayed behind, routines have shattered under the drumbeat of combat noises and the sight of troops occupying every corner. One day they are told that Ukrainian forces are staging a tactical withdrawal. The next day they hear about a successful counterattack. And then come the whispers of infiltration groups popping out literally out of nowhere. Official statements rarely align with the chaos on the ground, leaving the local population to sift through rumors in search of truth. And honestly, they can consider themselves lucky if the regime pays attention at all. Because even when the incursion itself, the very beginning of it, happened, the propaganda barely acknowledged the existence of this event ever happening. The entire region was forgotten, and people living there were discarded as mere complainers, who should be grateful that they are alive, and the local authorities even pay attention to their baseless claims. All this was just Ukrainian propaganda, according to them. All that while the TV cheerfully paraded the capture of another tiny micro-settlement, calling this a historical, life-changing victory. Meanwhile, the entire region of Kursk became the real-life battleground for thousands still living there. In homes across the region, families make tearful phone calls, hoping their loved ones are not on the casualty lists. One thing remained unchanged since the beginning of the invasion, however. These are the Russian TV channels and propagandistic channels that declare new victories almost daily, listing unfamiliar villages as liberated. Quote-unquote. Each claim signals another step towards dislodging the Ukrainian presence. But while these smaller gains add up, they're also a sobering reminder of just how drawn out and messy the conflict has become. Once the element of surprise wore off, the war in Kursk settled into a grueling slog of back-and-forth skirmishes, all while the rest of the front lines remain relatively active. And so unfortunately, now the Ukrainian leadership has to ask itself a question. Is holding Kursk worth this much strain? Should they cut the losses and retreat? Or do they keep holding for as long as possible, hoping that this can become their major talking point and ace up the sleeve in the upcoming negotiations? Far from Kursk's war-destroyed roads, Ukrainian and American officials met in Saudi Arabia, trying to form a path to some sort of peace or at least a truce. President Volodymyr Zelensky's tense encounters with President Trump at the end of February have chilled much-needed US support, leaving Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Jeddah to estimate Kyiv's willingness and preparedness to negotiate. There is talk of partial ceasefires in certain regions, possibly a freeze of Black Sea missile strikes, and even a prisoner exchange. But cynics suspect it's all just theater unless each side sees a tangible advantage. Ukraine's carrot on the diplomatic table appears to be its rare earth minerals, which the United States might want for economic and strategic reasons. Meanwhile, Europeans watch carefully, pumping billions of euros into defense programs and feeling sidelined. After all, if Washington and Kiev strike a deal, what does that mean for the rest of the continent? And what about Saudi Arabia's growing ambitions for regional and global influence? Pretty good questions if you ask me. Hosting these talks puts Riyadh in a position to shape outcomes that go far beyond Eastern Europe. The swirling uncertainty of intelligence sharing adds another dimension to the puzzle. The United States insists it never fully shut off critical intel to Ukraine, but offensive data is still withheld until certain conditions are met. Each day that passes without clarity on American support diminishes the Kiev's capacity to sustain a battle that has spilled onto Russian soil and everywhere else. Diplomacy becomes a balancing act. Ukraine cannot appear too eager for concessions, or it risks undercutting morale at home. I mean, imagine yourself as Ukrainian soldiers, spending their third year in ice-cold trenches, protecting every inch of your own motherland. And then you are told that your sacrifices will never disappear in vain, just to hear the very next day that your president decided to give up the territories, minerals, and shake hands with your number one enemy, Putin. This will not be taken lightly or well by those people who gave up everything for their country. So even though Zelensky might want to end the war as soon as possible, he has to think about those people too. Otherwise, it will be considered the worst betrayal possible in Ukraine's modern history. Yet the position of Zelensky cannot be too bold or aggressive either, or it just might forfeit game-changing aid from a superpower. Because Ukraine did survive that long thanks to the help from the West. And unlike some people claim, Ukraine is thankful, and it thanked more than once for all the assistance they received. Well, there you have it, guys. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.